Hi, I'm M. Pacer. I'm going to be talking first. I just want to point out that the slides that I'm talking about you can get them at that bit.ly link, so I'm going to leave this up while I'm giving this little mini introduction. You can get the notebook that I'm going to be showing you along with some notes and some ancillary files in a repo that I just put on GitHub. Some of you may have seen me doing that just now. Without any further ado, hopefully you all have your bit.ly link. It's Jupyter Config Traitlets 2018, with Jupyter Config Traitlets being capitalized. You can't capitalize 2018. All right, so I'm M. Pacer. I'm going to be talking about the Python and Traitlet side of our configuration system. Jupyter is an incredibly powerful ecosystem. It requires a lot of different pieces playing nicely together. And those pieces need to know about each other, and they can do so many different things that we need some way to tell them all this. That happens through our configuration system. And unfortunately, because it is so powerful, and it has so many options and so many things that depend upon each other, it's super fragile. And that's why, in large part, we wanted to be giving this talk, because we know from helping people as well as in our own experience that configuration issues happen all the time. Also, figuring out how to use configuration is a super important part of developing yourself in the Jupyter ecosystem. If you know how to do that, you're going to feel more familiar. You're going to understand what's going on. So we want to help you get through that. Want to hold your hand, and I assure you, it'll be all right. What I'm going to begin with is a bit about traitlets themselves and some of the config semantics. And this is the config talk repo on GitHub. So what we're going to start with is by importing some things. And then what we're going to do is to create a class that has configuration in it, and in particular, a class that knows how to accept config as like an object from the traitlets config module. So the name of that class that we're going to subclass is configurable. And we're going to call our class A. We're going to create A, and we're going to create a trait on A. That trait's name is going to be my trait, and it's going to be a Unicode trait. And in order for it to be configurable, you have to add this tag that says .tag config equals true. And then I have a little repper so that we can see the things that are happening. It's just bolding the name and then showing you the value. So bold name, italicized trait name, and then whatever the value of the trait. Great. So let's change that. So the way that we're going to change it first is by creating a config object. And the way to do that is to, the easiest way to do that is to start with a config dictionary. So that's going to be it has a top level key of the name of that class that you're going to want to configure, and then a key inside the value of that, of the name of the trait, and then whatever value that trait is going to take on. And that needs to be a value that is matching whatever type of trait you had assigned. So in this case, it's Unicode, so we're going to be fine with passing in not the default. And as you can see, what we have here is that trait is now set to not the default, passing in config equals config after wrapping that in the config object from traitlets.config. Great. Oh, and another way that you can set these traits is by populating them as a keyword argument. So this is one of the nice things about these configurable traitlets is they're automatically part of the init because they're hidden inside the quargs processing. Which means that if you're actually overwriting the init of a configurable, you should include quargs if you want to maintain this behavior. So as you can see, we can set it in the init as well. Great. So that's how we deal with one class. Now if we want to subclass that, it's going to inherit much of the same behavior. So I'm creating B, it inherits from A, and when I go to display B, it actually has this trait, and we're all happy. And so an additional little bit is that B will not just inherit A, but it'll inherit the ability to inherit it'll inherit A's assignments as well. So in this case, we have a config object where you said A has my trait, and then it has a value. And because B is getting from A, inherits from A, it will also take on that value when you instantiate B with that config object. But if you set that trait on the config object itself, so that's what we're doing here, is setting on the config object with the B string, setting my trait to B. B now has a new value. You can see we have these two values. A, it's not been overwritten, and B. And because B, it matches exactly, we've now overwritten whatever it was inheriting from A. So this is great, except sometimes you have to deal with classes that cannot themselves be configurable. Say when you're working on a server extension and you have to write an API handler for the notebook server. You can't multiply inherit from that because it conflicts with the way that Tornado's handlers work. So the way to solve that is to create a configurable class right next to it, pass in a config object into the non-configurable class that you're getting from something like a Jupyter app that I'd shown above, and then actually instantiate that so that then you can inherit the appropriate bits and bobs. So in this case, you import your API handler and then create your configurable like sidecar, and then in your handler, you instantiate that sidecar, and then you can get access to all the things inside. And this is really nice for when, say, you want to have like that nice inheritance going on, especially when this is not configurable, but it's inheriting from something else, and you don't know which part it's going to inherit from. All right, so now back to the slides. The code doesn't do anything, so it's just an example. And the thing is, I just showed you how to create objects that are configurable, but one of the things that you're probably going to want to do is to configure them not dynamically, to have config files that configure them for you. So one of the first things you need to understand before we even go into what these config files do, look like, are, etc., is the idea of priority for our config files, because there are many different places that you can be getting your config files from. What's going to have the highest priority is your local directory. So if you have a config file where the name matches in your directory, that's going to be what's read in. After that, you have a user level config, which is actually set via an environment variable, Jupyter config dir, which defaults to your home.jupyter. And I will mention that is a very useful thing to know in the context of when you're testing configuration, because it's the only way that you can overwrite things to have a temporary config without messing, so that you don't have to mess with your actual system to run your tests. Then we have environment level variables, or environment level configuration locations, which is, in my case, a environment called dev, and then system level configurations, where you have the base system etc Jupyter or user local etc Jupyter. Great. So that is not yet what we're going to do. And from this point, we are going to be moving back into this example. So I just mentioned where all those directories are. You can actually find this out because I'm not going to be sitting next to you when you are trying to solve this problem. Fortunately, there is a nice little command line utility called Jupyter. And so if you run Jupyter --paths, it will it'll tell you what the bases of those config directories are. So what it is that's going to define what the config files are is called a Jupyter app. And what it's going to be looking for is a name that matches whatever the name of that Jupyter app is, like it's a class level attribute, just in this case Jupyter simple. And it's going to replace any dashes that you have, oops. It's going to replace any dashes that you have with underscores. So in this case, Jupyter simple, we're going to create this little class. It's based off of Jupyter app. And so this is just going to show us all of the different config paths that it would look for, starting with the local directory, then going to my user directory, then my environment directory, my local etc Jupyter, and then etc Jupyter at the max system level. So if you've you've probably used some of these commands. One of the things that you can do is if you have Jupyter space notebook, Jupyter space nbconvert, Jupyter space any application that you're running that is a Jupyter app, you can infer that, well, the way that I'm going to write that config file is Jupyter underscore whatever that name is underscore config, because it always needs to finish with underscore config. And that can be either, and you might have noticed here that these are Python and JSON files, and it needs to be one of the two. So where JSON files are static and Python files are going to be interpreted, which is fun. You can do really neat things with that. To make this even easier though, all this is telling you is where all of the things are going to be found. But what's what partly we're announcing here is the existence of a new app called Jupyter config, which you can get with pip install Jupyter underscore config. And that'll give you a nice way to say, list every single config file that is accessible from your current directory. So in this case, these are all of the files that match the patterns that Jupyter is expecting that are accessible from the directory in which I'm running this notebook. So the details of what's in there right now don't matter too much, but now you don't have to just find them yourselves. You have access to all of them all at once. That's not all it does, but we'll get to that later. So the question is, how do you actually work with this config inside an application? And here we're going to be creating a new thing. It goes back and grabs our little like A, B things. And just to show you, these are the paths that it's looking for. One of those actually happens to exist. If you look up here, the test config that already is around. And when we go and we look at our test config get started, which is a method I did to set everything up, because if you want the config to load in a Jupyter app, you have to run self.initialize. Then now we have the ability to get access to those values. And just to show what's in there, the way that that's being set is a c.a.mytrait. That C is sort of a global thing that IPython is going to inject into there. You always have access to it if you're going to be treating something as a config file. And then we're setting it to be the value that tells us where we are. And why did we set that value to tell us where we are? Well, because we have to talk about specificity again. So if I'm going to, so I talked about this priority about what is going to be loaded before what gets priority. And I now have Jupyter conflict, which is a great name for an app. And these are all the places that it's going to look. Now we're going to get that started. What we're going to see is that we're setting in here a different value than what we were setting, than what A has. And that's true even if we now go and search through every one of our config files that I had access to above in that list. I can just search for this term. It's another feature of Jupyter app. Jupyter config search, and then my trait, because those are all the things. And actually, there are 4 files that all set my trait. Conflict, test, but then there's also these 2 conflicts. And so one of them is this system A value that has been completely ignored. And one of these is this B value that, that is overriding what A would have set more locally. So even though it's lower in priority, it is what's loaded. There's a little bit here. You can also set these things from the command line. And I'm going to move on because I'm slowly, very quickly running out of time. How long do I have? Sorry. 5 minutes? Okay, good. In terms of the other things where configuration matters, that's actually how we're also telling the notebook functionality. That's where we're telling ourselves as an app which extensions we have installed for the notebook server and the classic notebook front end. So these are called server extensions and NB extensions. Some facts about server extensions are that they're written in Python. They're going to extend the server functionality, and you write one for one front end, you write it for all of them because it's running on the server. NB extensions, on the other hand, only apply to the front end. They're written in JavaScript, and the way that they're scoped is in terms of the different sections of the classic notebook, which is notebook, edit, tree, terminal, or you can have a common .js that applies to all those sections. And if you want to if you want to actually use those files with a slight caveat that I'll get to in a second, they need to be named notebook.js, edit.js, tree.js, etc. So how do you manage your server extensions? Well, they're Python modules, so you can install and uninstall them using pip, conda, whatever you want. But then if you need to enable or disable them, what you're going to do is say Jupyter server extension enable, and then the name of your module, and I would suggest sys prefix, which is actually referring to sys.prefix, which adheres to it's not system, it's the sys module from Python that tells you what the prefix is for the Python interpreter that you're using. And when you do that, it's going to create a Jupyter notebook config.json somewhere on your system that has this kind of a value where your module name is now set to true for all of your server extensions. In terms of NB extensions, we can't pip install them in the same way. In fact, if they're going to be packaged up with a Python module, they're going to be installed, you have to first pip install that Python module, and then you can do NB extension install --pi because it's a Python module, and then that name, and uninstall in the exact same way. And if you're going to be uninstalling an NB extension and the Python package that you needed to, that you used to install it, first uninstall the NB extension, then the other, because it won't have access to the configuration anymore because you've uninstalled it, so it won't know what needs to be gotten rid of. And where these are placed is under the directory nbconfig, and then the name of the section .json, and then the content of that file would be something like load extensions, and then a key, module name, and whatever module name, and then whatever that base file happens to be for loading all of your extensions. So one of the newest features of the notebook is that you can auto-install extensions as part of your Python, as part of the actual Python packaging setup. So we've got, it's called confd, that's how we've been referring to it. And this refers to the place that we're going to be placing all of these config files at the end of the day. So for the notebook, it's Jupyter notebook config, because that's what our notebook app, or that's what our Jupyter app name is going to tell us what our configuration file should be called. And then .d, and then any JSON file underneath that is going to be loaded in. And similarly, NB extension, nbconfig slash whatever your section name .d is, and then any of the, so for example, nbconfig notebook.d, all of those JSON files are going to be loaded. And so this is super convenient. If you want to set that up, you need to have your config files in a directory that lives at the same level of your setup.py, and then inside that directory you'll have the name of the config file, and it needs to already have the name that you're going to want to place it there, because the easiest way to do this is through the setup.py data files system. And the way that you set that up is by having a list of tuples of the destination directory and the path that relative to setup.py that gets you to the file that you want to place there. And with that, I'm going to say thanks. And if there are any questions, they'll have to wait until after Darian talks, because he has a lot of interesting things to say.
Incredibly good timing.
I tried.
You succeeded. Okay, let's go. Sweet. Hello, I'm Darian. There we go. I'm a software engineer at 2 Sigma, and I am going to be talking about the Jupyter Lab configuration options that you have, and some of this is orthogonal to what Em just told you about, and some of it is superseding the NB extension bit, because Jupyter Lab extensions are 100% compatible with server extensions, but NB extensions and lab extensions are effectively analogs to each other. They're both front-end extensions. So here's what we'll cover. We'll cover 4 main topics. One is the lab setting system, and where the defaults and user overrides and system overrides all reside. We'll cover Workspaces, which is a new feature in Jupyter Lab that lets you pre-can layouts. We'll talk about extensions briefly, just how you install them, how you uninstall them, how you enable and disable them. And we'll talk about keyboard shortcuts with some caveats, but we'll get to that. So first of all, where is everything? Just like Em showed you with Jupyter Paths, Jupyter Lab also shows you its paths. You run the Jupyter Lab paths command, and you'll get 3 directories back. The first is where the built application resides. The second is where your own user settings will reside. These are your overrides to system defaults. And the third is where your pre-canned layouts, your workspaces, basically reside. Okay, so first, the settings system. There are 3 tiers of settings in Jupyter Lab. You don't actually need to know this. This is just the places where you could override things. But as an end user, for example, all you really need to know is you modify settings and they sit in that user settings directory that you got. However, if you're an extension author, what you need to know is where you can set those defaults for your users. And if you're a deployer, you need to know how you can change some of those defaults without basically masquerading as your user. So there's a known location where you could override them, and that is your overrides JSON file. So let's look at the easiest way as an end user you would modify your settings. Some of them, you don't have to do anything at all. Really, they're just in the menu system. You can toggle them. That was the theme being changed, and that's a setting, but it's just a user action. So we know, based on that user action, that the user wanted to modify the state of lab, and that gets written to the settings system without any further need for the user to do anything. However, you could affect the same change by going into the advanced settings editor, copying the default, and modifying it. The default theme happens to be called Jupyter Lab Light. You can change it to Jupyter Lab Dark. You hit save, and the same exact action occurs. And under the hood, that's what was happening when you went to the menu system and modified settings. Okay, so where did that default come from? Now, if you're in the settings editor that you just saw in the little clip, you'll see a list of extensions in the left-hand side, and if you hover over each one, you get a more detailed name. So what you see here is the place where those settings got set initially. And we have a naming convention here. This is not a strict thing that everyone has to follow, but it turns out to be quite helpful to name your extension in a way that matches the actual JSON file that defines your settings. So this particular extension is called the app utils extension, and it's under the Jupyter Lab org. And inside it, there's a Jupyter Lab plugin called themes, which is where the default for Jupyter Lab Lite was set. And here are 3 views of that themes JSON file. This is a JSON file that was written by the extension author, and I'm just showing it in 3 different ways in Jupyter Lab. The top left is our JSON viewer, which is a read-only view that just shows you the structure of the file. The top right is the raw file, and you can see it's pretty straightforward. It's a JSON schema file, and it says the one and only setting that I have as the themes package is a key called theme, and its default value is Jupyter Lab Lite. And at the bottom, you see that same JSON schema rendered as some documentation for the end user to see, so they could copy this over to the right-hand side, override it, and change their default theme value. Okay, so now the way Jupyter Lab knows where to find that themes JSON file we looked at is inside the actual extensions package JSON file. So every Jupyter Lab extension is an NPM package, and all NPM packages must have a package JSON file. The way you tell Jupyter Lab that this particular NPM package is also a Jupyter Lab extension is that it has this extra key. You can see it on the left-hand side at the bottom. It's called Jupyter Lab, and it has two attributes. One is extension set to true. That's how we know it's a Jupyter Lab extension. And the other is where are the schemas for this particular extension. Because an extension can have multiple plugins that it exports, you specify a schema dir here because each plugin could have its own default settings. So that schema's directory, schema without an S, that schema directory contained that file themes.json that we were looking at earlier. But there could have been an arbitrary number of plugins that this package is exporting, and there could have been many more JSON schemas defined in there. Okay. So this is the bit where I have to give you a little caveat. I'm going to show you how you modify keyboard shortcuts because they are in the settings system, and this is clearly a configuration thing. What's going to change is where in the UI you see this. So right now, keyboard shortcuts logically live as one of the plugins whose settings you can modify. This will probably move to some different spot in the setting editor and get its own tab, but the mechanics of it will be very similar. So I don't think it's problematic to show you. Just know that it might not reside in the exact same spot. And in fact, if you look at my screenshot, all the way on the left-hand side, you'll see that I have an older version of Lab, right? The tabs and commands and those things are written as strings, but if we look at Lab running right now, that's changed. We've got these little logos. This is a quickly moving project. But if you have modified your keyboard shortcuts, we will make sure to port them over to whatever new system. If you're an extension author, there might be a little bit more pain involved, unfortunately, but we'll give you an upgrade path for that. So this is the hard way of modifying your keyboard shortcuts, and what you do is say you want to change the activate next tab from the default, which is Control-Shift square bracket, and you want it to be Control-Shift, what is that, parentheses. You copy that blob over, and you modify it, and the second you hit save, it becomes your new keyboard shortcut. Keyboard shortcuts the easy way. This summer we had a team of interns at Cal Poly, and they built many wonderful things, and among them is this shortcut UI, and the way you install it is that command at the bottom, Jupyter Lab extension install at jupyterlab/shortcut UI. I'm sorry, is that not visible? Maybe I should bring that higher. There you go. And what you get is this UI, which I actually have installed here, so I can show you. And it's effectively all the same default shortcuts that you saw, but it's a nice GUI editor, and you can modify them, or you can add multiple shortcuts that do the same action, because sometimes that's what you want. This also is built on our current setting system, and it will need to change, but of course we will change it in tandem, so the change should be transparent to end users. Okay, I'm going to switch to a demo to show you what workspaces are and move away from the setting system. So as I said before, workspaces are basically saved layouts of the state of your Jupyter Lab session at any given moment. And there's two kinds of workspaces. One is what you've been using all along, and you just may not have been using this nomenclature, and that is the default workspace you get when you go to this URL, just /lab. Or if you're in an environment like a Jupyter Hub environment or wherever else it's hosted, whatever the default page you land on, that's your default workspace. And so if I refresh the page, the workspace reconstructs itself. And in fact, you can see I'm using Chrome, but if I switch to Firefox, and I refresh the page in Firefox, I get the same things. If I modify my layout, so now I have these two things side by side, and I switch back to Chrome, that modification comes through because workspaces actually sit on the server. And there are a lot of ramifications to this. One is that you can pre-deploy these things for your users. Say you want to have a notebook open on the left-hand side and a bunch of resources open on the right-hand side, or whatever custom extensions you have that you want them to see. You can have the default place where they land show them all these things so that they're not looking at a blank slate. Although our blank slate's not that bad. It's this launcher screen that does give you a lot of options about what to do next. However, you might want to customize that. So one feature that's in the works and should be out quite soon is a command line interface to export and import workspaces. There is a way currently to do that manually, but I won't show it because it's painful. That's the default workspace. Now, you might want to have multiple workspaces that do different things. So here's the workspace called foo, and I'm going to open up this package JSON file, and I open up the same URL in Firefox now, and foo now has that package JSON file. And importantly, if I go back to the default workspace, I haven't modified that. And you could create arbitrary workspaces by just changing the name in the URL. So you have /lab/workspaces foo. You could have workspaces bar, workspaces baz, whatever you like. And the other thing that you could do with workspaces is you may want to copy the contents of one workspace into another. So if I hit back and go to foo, suppose what I really want is to clone the default workspace. I can add the URL parameter clone, and what it does is it now replaced what's inside foo with what was inside the default workspace. So similarly, suppose I have the workspace called bar, and what I really want is for bar to have what was in foo. I can say clone equals foo. Now it's not just clone without a value because that was default, it's clone with the value of the thing I want to copy. And now the bar workspace has the contents of foo in it. Now suppose something goes wrong. I think there might be a slide for this actually. Suppose something goes wrong and what's going on in your workspace is somehow corrupted. Maybe there's an extension that's doing something bad. We try to recover from these. If a file doesn't exist, we transparently just allow you to continue. It just won't open that file. And in fact, it'll resave the workspace without that file in it. But you may find yourself in a state that really is problematic. You can go to the command palette and you can reset your application state. And now this workspace is empty. If you find yourself in the unlikely situation that your workspace is completely broken and won't even load, so right now we're in the foo workspace, you could add the reset query string, and that'll blow away your workspace as well. Hopefully you don't need to remember that, but if you do, just reset, reset, reset. I was told repeating is good. Okay, I just hope you don't need to do that. So that shortcut UI that I just showed you, again, the way you install it is Jupyter Lab extension install, that name. And here's how you disable it if you don't want it there, or enable it if you change your mind. These values get written to a file called pageconfig.json, and the place you find that, again, we'll go back to a lab terminal and do Jupyter Lab paths. This is the magic command. Oh, okay, good point. Is that readable? Okay, great. So the place you find that is in your application directory, in the settings folder, and there's a page config. So if I show you what's inside it, it should, I don't think there's anything there. Yeah, so at one point I had disabled something and it sat in this array. Then I re-enabled it so this array is empty. But that's where things happen. And you can actually, as a deployer, without having to run these commands, you could copy a page config over from one deployment to another to make sure the state of your deployment is just the way you want it to be. Okay. And also, read these documents. This talk will be posted on the JupyterCon page sometime in the next day, let's say. And I guess that's really where I want to leave off. There's a lot of complexity here that I've glossed over, but this should give you just the lay of the land on what the configuration options with Lab are. Please install Lab. There's 2 commands there. I suggest the first one. And if you have any questions for either of us, now's the time. Thank you very much.
Before the questions, I want to say, there's going to be sprints tomorrow that all of you should be going to, and we can talk about this more in person.
Good point. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes. Escape L, like a keyboard shortcut? It's probably a keyboard shortcut that we haven't implemented the same way. It could just be a missing shortcut in the list of defaults that we have. So it may well just be an oversight. We should add it if that's the case. If it is not, and it's an actual bug, we should fix that. So whichever one of those two things it is, please file an issue with Jupyter Lab and we'll take a look. You can, if you go to your advanced settings editor and you see the keyboard shortcuts on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of all the available shortcuts. So if you don't find that shortcut that you want in there, it's probably not been implemented and probably just needs to be. If you do find it in there and it's not working, then it's a bug. Yeah. Go for it.
Because I'm the only one who's written it, and y'all should participate in that tomorrow, because it's relatively new. The question was, why isn't the Jupyter config app part of Jupyter, even though it is part of Jupyter? It's just under my repo right now, because it has not existed for very long. So come and make it great. So part of the reason that this talk exists is in order to have one place to find this information.
We wanted to say this is the canonical way of doing things, and we recognize that some of this is non-trivial. And part of that is we'll definitely post our slides, this talk will be online, and part of it is, we'll incorporate in docs too. Sure thing. We are actively documenting things. If there are things that ought to be prioritized differently, we can have a conversation about that, but we are aware that we need better docs, and we're working on it.
And if you have a specific idea of where those docs should live, that is one of the hardest things for these things, because they apply to everything and everything that lives anywhere, along with anyone else's third-party things. It's very hard to, part of the reason that it's been so disparate is that it's emerged over time in all of these different places. And so that's why, so for example, I have a GitHub repo of my notebook that has all of the stuff that I went through explaining how to do that. And the slides will be in that GitHub repo as well. So that's not going to be the final location of all of that, but it's a consolidated place for at least my stuff.
Anyone else?
One comment.
Sure.
The name of tomorrow is not sprints.
Oh, very sorry.
What's it called?
Open Studio.
And Community Day.
And Community Day.
Okay.
People who want to code, you want people to come and interact, but to come and write documentation or show their project. And we are struggling with the naming because sprints tend to convey the idea that you need to be already in the project and know what you're going to do and are going to dive into code for a long time. And it's not what we want to convey.
Oh yeah, no, the reason we're doing this event in a giant hotel in the middle of Manhattan is so that people who are not in the project can also come. So absolutely.
So it's not a sprint. It can be a stroll. It can be an amble. We'll walk with you. It'll be lovely.
All right, well, thank you very much.